आपको ये पता है क्रिमिनल ट्रायल में आपको पता है चालान की कॉपी के पैसे हमें नहीं देने वकील को। तो जिसको ये पता है वो खड़ा हो जाएगा। तो जब सामने वकील को पता है कि इस बंदे को मालूमात है तो वो आपसे आर्ग्यू नहीं करेगा, आपसे रेजिस्ट नहीं करेगा। तो ये वो छोटी छोटी टेक्निकल चीजें हैं जो कि कानूनी तौर पे बाख्तियार बनाती हैं उस प्रिजनर को जो कि वल्नरेबल है, मोस्ट वल्नरेबल है, और उस जस्टिस सिस्टम के अंदर रहते हुए लड़ रहा है। तो ये एक बहुत बड़ा आपका कंपोनेंट है जो कि प्रिजन के अंदर फर्स्ट ऑफ काइंड जो प्रिजन पैरालीगल प्रोग्राम है सिंध का 4 प्रिजन के अंदर ये अपना रोल अदा कर रहा है।
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the second podcast in a series of conversations that we've recently started here at the Committee for the Welfare of Prisoners. Our focus is on corrections and talking about prisons and the prison population. Not much is said or heard about prisons in general in Pakistan. A fleeting reference here and there when a case is of a high-profile nature and there's an incarceration element. But in general, there's a dearth of information, of storytelling, and of initiatives. So this is the gap that we hope to fulfill with this podcast effort. In the previous one, we covered babies behind bars, innocent children that accompany their mothers who are incarcerated in prisons. And we tried to learn from the soft interventions and the initiatives that are being led by the government of Sindh in the form of early learning centers and certain reform efforts that have been put into play over the last few years. And very little is known about these. So we had an interesting dialogue on that. Today, we're returning to speak more about reform in the context of prisoners, but through the lens of legal empowerment and to see these series of initiatives in the form of a one-of-a-kind prison paralegal program that is being run very quietly in the prisons in Sindh. But in more general terms, we seek to understand what clinical legal education is, how that differs from formal legal education, what the scope for this is in our context, and to learn really of alternative means of accessing justice. The United Nations a few years ago estimated that about 4 billion people across the world live outside the protection of the law. Now, this means that they could have been displaced from their lands, their villages, rendered stateless. This means that they could have been subjected to forms of violence or just, in general terms, deprived of basic necessities. And one thing that has developed since the 1950s is this new genre, this new cadre of what are otherwise called community lawyers, barefoot lawyers, or paralegals, community paralegals. They've hardly been recognized in Pakistan. Very little has been said about them, whether academically or in terms of development sector reports and case studies. So that's what we're looking to learn about today. And let me start this off by introducing our esteemed panelists today. We don't have one, we don't have two, but we have 3 subject matter experts, okay? And this is a very big thing because this is a niche area and we've managed to pull these guys together for you. So we will not be subjected to the tyranny of oversimplifications that generalists put forward. We're going to have a very nuanced, informative, and technical discussion, albeit in simple terms. So it is an absolute privilege and an honor to first and foremost introduce Anbeen Atif Mirza. She's an assistant professor at the Sheikh Ahmed Hassan School of Law at LUMS, from where she did her law degree. She then went on to doing her LLM from University of Michigan's Law School. She's currently the faculty director at LUMS's Office of Accessibility and Inclusion, where she's starting the conversations and dialogues around consent, harassment, and inclusion. She also serves as a board member of Pakistan's leading cyber rights organization, the Digital Rights Foundation. She's involved in a host of human rights work in different pockets, in Punjab and in Sindh, but her primary areas of sort of work and expertise lies in clinical legal education. And when it comes to paralegal programs, she's specializing in creating content within the domains of alternative dispute resolution, women's right to property, basic civic education, and citizenship. So thank you very much, Anbeen, for joining us. I'm going to move on to also introducing our second panelist. Omar Bashir Manyar is a rule of law expert, similarly, who has experience both in the provinces of Sindh and Punjab and some work at the federal level in ICT as well. He's been a legal empowerment practitioner for a number of years, working very closely with vulnerable segments, specifically juveniles, women and children, and prisoners. He's also done some leading work in Sindh in the context of legal aid programming. paralegal programming, and more broadly, he's worked on supply side criminal justice outcomes as well. Working both with provincial and federal governments, Umar has previously been an associate director at the Legal Aid Society. He then went on to becoming deputy team lead for Punjab at the Justice System Support Program. He's also a graduate of LUMS. We seem to be having LUMS dominate the panel. And then he went on recently to do his MA in Governance, Development and Public Policy from the Institute of Development Studies, where he focused on governance and development in conflict-affected settings. Thank you so much, Umar, for taking out the time. And last but not the least, we have one of our very own, Sana Sharif, who is a program manager at the Committee for the Welfare of Prisoners. I say one of our own, but rightfully seated here as a panelist, since she is the one at the forefront. She is leading not just Pakistan's only, but perhaps South Asia's only prisoner-led paralegal program. She's been working at the Legal Aid Office Committee for Welfare of Prisoners since 2017. Prior to this, she was engaged in strategic economic support for marginalized women and men. She also provided support in the context of working for landless peasants and farmers and workers. She currently not only looks after the paralegal program, but a wide host of rehabilitation interventions in juvenile prisons and women prisons across it. Sana, thank you very much for allowing me to sabotage your podcast and take over and put you on the hot seat as a subject matter expert. So let's begin now. I'd like to start off with a question for Angbeen. Angbeen, could you please explain to us in very rudimentary terms the actual difference between clinical legal education and how that differs from formal legal education, in the sense that all of us understand it as a law degree, and the empowerment potential that the former bears in the context of Pakistan and the justice sector problems, where so many people are yearning for justice or simply unable to access complex systems for their everyday needs. And feel free to mention some of the clinical work that you've been leading at LUMS.
Thanks, Haya. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk about something that I know is very close to all of our hearts collectively. So thanks for that. So clinical legal education it can actually also very much be formal legal education, but is generally, like you're saying correctly, seen as kind of an informal alternative maybe to kind of traditional forms of legal education that we think of. So I guess I'd like to contrast it from traditional legal methodology in teaching, which is more kind of Socratic method, or even it is the idea that, there is a law professor with all the knowledge who is kind of standing at a podium and imparting that knowledge to a large class of students with, maybe an assistant or two. But clinical legal education, the idea is very easily understood if you think about medical schools, right? So in medical college, when students hit third year, it's a general practice that they'll start actually working with real clients, and they call it clinics, literally, right? So that's where the idea comes from. So when law students, and it differs across the world when they start their clinics, but when they have basic core education completed, they are in a position to be able to actually give advice to real life clients, and that's where clinical legal education comes in. It's kind of a practical hands-on exposure to real life law before we send them out into the world of legal practice as actual lawyers with responsibilities towards clients. So the thing is, also with specific regard to Pakistan, there are jurisdictions across the world where they allow students to appear before courts. They have student practice rules. Pakistan does not have this provision. So when we talk about clinics, there are multiple ways in which a clinic could work. The most elaborate clinic would be a legal aid clinic, right? Where you have an office which is open to the public. People walk in. Your students manage those, clients from the start all the way to the end. They do the interviews, they do the record keeping, they do the note taking, they do the pleadings, drafting, and they do the advocacy as well. So that's one thing that you can do. And you can have specialized legal aid clinics. You can have general legal aid clinics. I am unaware of law schools in the country so far with a full-fledged running legal aid clinic. However, given that there are no student practice rules, the way that, for instance, us at LUMS envisage hopefully setting up a clinic in the near future is we'll have a lawyer who will be kind of a full-time lawyer on our roster, who will then be receiving kind of hands-on support from the students so they can do everything all the way up to when they appear in court. When they can't actually argue, they'll have to stand up next to the lawyer. So it'll be like being an associate, but probably with more responsibility than a first-year associate, and not being able to argue. So that's one form of clinic. The second form of clinic that I think we'll be talking about more in this program is street law. Street law is very popular for a variety of reasons, primarily because it costs you very little, especially in comparison to a life client clinic, right? Where you need an office and legal expertise and all of that. Street law is it's literally picking an audience off the street and giving and kind of doing these interactive legal awareness sessions with them. I'm sure Umar will have more to say about that. So that's all I'm going to say about street law right now. But historically, it's it started out. It's been very popular in apartheid South Africa, where they used it to kind of inform people of their legal rights and help the movement. And it's also been a law school activity in Georgetown in the States for 40 years. Now, it started in the 70s, and this year, in fact, this month, they are celebrating their 50 years of street law. So it's been around for a very long time. And so street law has been a model that LUMS has also adopted. I know that Hamdard has adopted, the Umar, where we have we haven't been able to reach particular audiences that we would like to in the future, perhaps, for example, prisoners or laborers. But at LUMS, we work with secondary school students, mostly from kind of impoverished areas. It works very well for us in various practical ways because it's a captive audience. So when we go, they're there. We've tried working with communities, but because currently we don't have long-lasting relations with communities, it's a bit much to expect that communities are going to show up to your session every single time. They have other things, etc. But anyway, but moving on to your next question from here. So clinical legal education is great for law students from a faculty perspective in that it teaches them, hands-on law. It teaches them many things about planning, about lesson delivery, about thinking on your toes, about just legal expertise and much more, actually. But today we talk about how it benefits the audience, right? The street audience that you're talking to. And so even if I just speak right now about what we do at LUMS, which is do a street law program with impoverished communities and schools, it creates the citizens of tomorrow, right? So these are, in our country at least, I don't know who's going to be watching this, but at least Pakistan, when you walk into a prison, and especially if you walk into, let's say, a juvenile prison or even otherwise, you see a very particular social class represented in that prison. The people who are going into prison are very unaware of their legal rights. They are unaware of their rights as citizens. What fundamental rights they have under the Constitution. What is a Constitution? What is labor? What rights does a police officer have when they come and talk to me? What can I do? So that's the kind of law. And so that's why street law is also really known as practical law. I mean, there are things in the books. And then there's things that is real life advice that you give to your street audience when you're doing this practical law, right? This is the law, but this is how you're going to use it. So that's what we've been doing. And I mean, unfortunately, in COVID, we had to kind of discontinue because our schools did not have online setup, the schools that we were going to. But we're looking forward to starting again in January. And I do think that it inspires students. Students begin to see themselves as more than just, let's just rephrase that. Say they see themselves as more empowered as they might have thought themselves to be before the street law program starts. So consistent feedback has been they look forward to their street law classes. My law students are just inspired into preparing harder, working harder, going back to their classes every week with this excitement that you don't always see in other kind of theoretical law courses or even otherwise. So the empowerment potential is huge, and I'd like to talk about the work that we do at LAS as well, but I could hold off on that if you want, perhaps talk about it at a later stage, because there's a lot of empowerment potential that we've seen in the work in the prisons and with women's rights and ADR and all of that. So yeah, that would be my 2 cents so far.
Okay, thank you, Angbeen. I'll come back to you to get some more details on the programs that you've been a part of when they've been rolled out in the community at large. I'd like to turn to Umar right now. So Angbeen spoke about the real life sort of element of this law, sort of law transcending into where it becomes a guarantor, in effective terms, a guarantor of equality, a law for the people, a law that's simplified. So, and the immense potential that it has, not just for the empowerment of the non-lawyer and the community, those that are illiterate, those that are impoverished, but just law students themselves. So what is your understanding of community legal empowerment, paralegals, paralegalism? What is the textbook sort of definition of how this is? How is it being played out in Pakistan? But also, please do touch upon this question that we're all perturbed by, which is that are these community paralegals recognized by the bar associations, by the legal fraternity, by any other associations as such? So yeah.
I think it's an interesting transition point, trying to connect clinical legal education programs and then community paralegal programs. Right? There's some similarities in terms of what they can do, but very quickly, sort of what legal empowerment is, right? And Bean spoke about sort of legal awareness, which is what we've done during street law clinics, and that's the first step ordinarily of legal empowerment. It's important to be able to know what it is, and then I know Haya and Legal Aid is familiar with the legal empowerment cycle, which is know the law, then you want to be able to support people to use the law, and then ideally after that's done, you want to collect those individual experiences of using the law in order to lead to policy reform. So that shapes the law. But for me, I think I also look at legal empowerment as a sustainable way of helping people or supporting people. So you want to, at some point as a practitioner or as an organization, you want to become redundant. And you can do that by supporting people to be able to help themselves. And so you want to lead the system, a legal aid office or community-based paralegals themselves or clinical programs aren't necessary anymore in order to enable people to exercise their rights. And I think the clinical legal education movement in particular lends itself quite well to one aspect of legal empowerment, which is the legal awareness aspect. The other thing that I think clinics do quite well, before I move on to just legal empowerment, is be able to deal with the right services, right? And I think that's the second step for legal empowerment, which is to be able to support people in how to use the law. So I can be aware of my rights, but I won't know what government department to apply to or how to write an application, to the ombudsperson, etc. So from that perspective, is different overlap there. But that's fundamentally what legal empowerment is, right? So that people know the law, they can use the law, and that they're inform policy reform efforts, and their experiences are taken to sort of government stakeholders. Community paralegals are quite a popular movement, or have been quite a world, and I think we've seen programs now develop in Pakistan as well. You spoke about the prison paralegal program that really has the pioneering effort for community paralegals. And then at the same time, there have been similar efforts around human rights related community paralegal programs. Sana and Haya will be able to speak a little bit more about some of the other community paralegal programs, whether it's in rights of women towards for inheritance, etc. Having said that, so we call these programs community paralegal programs right now, but they've existed in some form, throughout society. There's, people will have some community leader or community elder or somebody who's informed or somebody who's had a similar experience that they will turn to and ask for advice or ask for support. And I think what we try to do in community paralegal programs is identify who those people are and then extend our support to the community, but through these individuals who've either received training or who already have their experience that they can use. And so, if we look at the prison paralegal program, for example, the idea was identify prisoners that have already gone through the criminal justice system, so they have pre-existing knowledge, but then at the same time give them a little bit of additional support in terms of training, in terms of how to run a clinic, how to create legal awareness for new prison inmates, etc., and then be able to really have a community paralegal as a connection point between the community and the formal justice system, if you will. To your sort of last part of your question, there isn't formal recognition, and I think here's an example of a wasted opportunity recently. which was sort of the legal, there was a big movement towards legal aid legislation in the country. We saw that legal aid legislation in Punjab, we saw it in KP at the federal level as well. And here was an opportunity where clinical legal education, community paralegals, legal aid provided by all could have been recognized under the ambit of a larger interpretation of what is legal. And we've seen similar legislation in other parts of the world, but Pakistan doesn't have. But I think there's still opportunities for recognition of legal. There's some risks there, which talk about if we have time, in terms of recognizing community paralegals and the risk of creating an alternative profession, etc. But at the time, so there's very little recognized community-based paralegals at the moment, and I do think as a result they're a little bit underutilized. I'll stop there and we can stop.
Yeah, you brought up a sore point, because one would think that we've sort of ushered in an era of very progressive legislation, and you have the Federal Level Legal Aid and Justice Authority Act that's come in, but it's just taking too long for the rules and the implementation. And I believe both in Punjab and in KPK, the new legal aid legislation specifically, at least for the first time in the context of statutes, you're seeing that importance being given to clinical education. But I think the bar councils sort of need to catch up on this and really do some high-level advocacy with law colleges, etc. Let's sort of hear more about what's happening in the prisons, because the two of you both mentioned that in passing. So I'll turn over to Sana now, who's, as I mentioned in the introduction, she's been leading the prison paralegal program. I believe it's being executed in 4 prisons in Sindh. सना, आप ग्रास रूट लेवल पे आप ही काम कर रही हैं, सबसे ज़्यादा जो एक्यूरेट सिचुएशन है, जो पोटेंशियल है, या लेट्स स्टार्ट विद द कंडीशंस इन प्रिजन्स. थोड़ा सा कॉन्टेक्स्ट हमारी ऑडियंस के लिए बताएं कि व्हाट आर प्रिजन कंडीशंस लाइक, व्हाट आर द राइट्स एंड एंटाइटलमेंट्स रियली दैट आर प्रेजेंट for prisoners. Is this environment ripe for such community legal empowerment? And community here is the prison population. So just tell us what the situation is at the grassroots level in prisons in Sindh.
थैंक यू भैया कि मुझे आपने मौका दिया कि मैं प्रिजन ग्राउंड के हवाले से इस पर बात कर सकूं. एक्चुअली जहां प्रिजन के हक़ाइक़ की बात है तो करंटली अगर हम प्रिजन पॉपुलेशन का स्टेटस देखें तो तकरीबन 19,000 से अबव है, और इसमें मेजॉरिटी जो है हमारे अंडर ट्रायल प्रिजनर्स हैं. और जिस हम प्रिजन पैरालीगल जहाँ प्रोग्राम इनिशिएट किया गया है, उनमें सबसे पहले जहाँ हमने इसको पायलट किया था वो सेंट्रल प्रिजन कराची था, जिसमें मोस्ट हाईली पॉपुलेटेड प्रिजन का रेशो था, जहाँ पे ज़्यादातर यूटीपीज आते थे और जिनको अपने किसी भी लीगल एजुकेशन के हवाले से कोई मालूमात या आगाही नहीं थी. इस हवाले से प्रिजन पैरालीगल प्रोग्राम जो है, जो कि गुज़िश्ता तकरीबन 2015 में इनिशिएट किया गया था, और अब 5 साल हो चुके हैं इस प्रोग्राम को, और वीकली बेसिस पे जो भी हमारी क्लासेस होती हैं, जो पैरालीगल्स रन करते हैं. थोड़ा सा मैं बैकग्राउंड के हवाले से बात करूंगी. जैसे उमर ने लीगल एम्पावरमेंट अप्रोचेस की बात की, तो उसकी इम्प्लीमेंटेशन जो है वो मैं अपनी आंखों से उस प्रिजन ग्राउंड के अंदर देखती हूँ. क्योंकि अगर हम बात करते हैं कि हम कानून के बारे में जानें और उसको इस्तेमाल करें और उसको हिकमत अमली की बुनियादों पर लेकर जाएं, तो हमें प्रिजन में नज़र आता है. एक्चुअली जो आपके जेल पैरालीगल्स हैं वो उन नई आने वाली आमद को, यानी कि उस अंडर ट्रायल प्रिजनर्स को एक मालूमात देने का ज़रिया बनते हैं जिनको कानूनी नुमाइंदगी की ज़रूरत है, या जिनको छोटे छोटे दीगर लीगल मसाइल का सामना है. तो ये वो ब्रिज का गैप अदा करते हैं उस प्रिजन्स के अंदर, ताकि उन कैदियों को वो टाइम जो प्रिजन में है, जो कि क्रिमिनल जस्टिस सिस्टम के अंदर रहते हुए उनको गुजारना है. क्योंकि आपका जो जेल पैरालीगल से वो खुद बुनियादी तौर पर वो सज़ा याफ्ता कैदी ही है ट्रेंड, जो कि उस तमाम जस्टिस क्रिमिनल के मराहिल से गुजर कर यहाँ आया है, और जो हक़ाइक़ उसने देखे हैं ऑन ग्राउंड, तो वो चाहता है कि वो आने वाले नए यूटीपीज़ को उन मुश्किलात से निकाले. तो वो ह्यूमन ग्राउंड इम्पैक्ट हमें उस प्रिजन पैरालीगल प्रोग्राम का नज़र आता है प्रिजन्स के अंदर. तो गुज़िश्ता 5 सालों में हमने तकरीबन 260 से ज़्यादा कन्विक्ट्स को ट्रेंड किया है, जो कि 4 प्रिजन्स के अंदर अपनी सर्विसेज देते रहे हैं, और तकरीबन इन्हीं पैरालीगल्स के थ्रू हमने 6000 से ज़्यादा नई जेल आमद को जो है वो कानूनी मालूमात फराहम की हैं जो कि उनकी ज़िंदगी से जुड़ी हैं. जैसे उन्होंने बात की एप्लीकेशंस कैसे लिखनी है, आपका अगर कोर्ट में जज वेकेंट है, आपका केस नहीं लग रहा है, आपकी हेयरिंग्स नहीं हो रही हैं, तो हमारे प्रिजनर्स को ये मालूम नहीं है कि हम एप्लीकेशन देकर कोर्ट दूसरे कोर्ट में आप केस ट्रांसफर करवा सकते. बहुत छोटी छोटी मालूमात कि आपने अगर बेल फाइल करवा दी है, मतलब आपने चालान से पहले बेल फाइल करवा दी है, तो आपकी बेल रिजेक्ट हो गई है. तो हमारे प्रिजनर्स का, क्योंकि आज जब प्रिजन के अंदर जाते हैं ना, तो पेशेंस लेवल बहुत कम होता है, तो प्रिजनर्स को होता है कि फ़ौरन जल्दी बेल फाइल हो जाए. तो ये छोटी छोटी टेक्निकल चीज़ें हैं जो कि हमारा पैरालीगल क्योंकि तरबियत याफ्ता होता है, एज अ ट्रेन लॉयर तो नहीं होता, लेकिन वो बुनियादी मालूमात उन्हें फराहम कर सकता है जो कि उनके केस के हल के लिए बेहतर हो सकते हैं. दूसरा, कम्युनिटी के हवाले से जैसे हम बात करें कम्युनिटी पैरालीगल में, तो हमारे जेल पैरालीगल्स का जो बुनियादी स्ट्रक्चर है वो प्रिजन की पॉपुलेशन को ही एज अ कम्युनिटी लेकर जाता है. तो वो उस होल कम्युनिटी के अंदर जितने भी मसाइल हैं, खासकर कैदियों के हवाले से, चाहे वो ओल्ड एज प्रिजनर्स के हवाले से आपके रूल हैं, या आपके हमारे कितने प्रिजन के अंदर ऐसे कैदी हैं जो ओल्ड एज प्रिजनर्स हैं और उनको कोई रिलीफ नहीं मिल रहा है एज पर लॉ, कि उनको किसी भी रूल के तहत, रूल 148 है आई थिंक, प्रिजन रूल, जिसके तहत उनको रिलीज किया जाए. तो वो डेटा, प्रिजन पैरालीगल का काम बुनियादी जेल से वो डेटा फराहम करना है हमें, जिसकी बुनियाद पर हम उस गवर्नर्स या प्रिजन डिपार्टमेंट के गवर्नर्स के रिफॉर्म में बेहतरी ला सकें और नई सिफारिशात आगे रख सकें. तो बेसिकली बहुत मैं कहूँगी कि हार्ट टचिंग काम है, और लोगों के जज्बातों से जुड़ा ये वो चीज़ है जो कि अगर एक बंदे, मतलब एक इंसान को ये मालूम हो जाए, जेल में आने वाले इंसान को, कि अगर मुझे मजिस्ट्रेट के सामने ये बयान देना होता और मुझे पता होता कि मैं बोल सकता हूँ, तो आज मेरा केस किस लेवल पर होता. तो वो पेन आप शायद नहीं महसूस कर सकते. प्रिजन में आके जब मैं लोगों से बात करती हूँ, तो जब लोग मुझसे इस तरह की जुड़ी हुई अपनी एक्सपीरियंसेस बताते हैं, तो मुझे अंदाज़ा होता है कि ये लीगल एजुकेशन सिर्फ प्रिजनर्स के लिए नहीं, इवन कि आपके जनरल करिकुलम में भी शामिल होनी चाहिए, क्योंकि आपको सिनेरियोज नहीं पता अपनी लाइफ के कि आप किस वक्त किस तरह के हालात को फेस करें. तो ये लीगल एजुकेशन जिसकी हम बात करें, वो मोस्ट इम्पॉर्टेंट थिंग है कि एक एज अ जनरल सिटीजन के लिए कि उसको पता होना चाहिए कि कानून क्या है, उसके राइट्स क्या हैं. तो ये आई थिंक मैंने इमोशनल कर दिया.
नहीं, thank you, Sana. You've taken us, to a high point right now. For whoever the next speaker will be, no doubt, you've made their job a little bit more challenging, I would say. But आपने light-hearted comments aside, आपने दो बातें करी जो बड़ी इम्पोर्टेंट है, और मैं उस पर जोर देना चाहूँगी कि एक पैरालीगल का जो काम है वो मालूमात देने तक सॉर्ट ऑफ लिमिटेड है, तो वो कानूनी इमदाद नहीं फराहम कर सकते. समवन ने कहा they can be a source that connects you with a lawyer when you need a lawyer. तो ये मालूमात देने का काम है. लेकिन आपने एक और चीज़ पे रोशनी डाली जो बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग है, कि सिर्फ इंफॉर्मेशन देना इनका काम नहीं है, बट हमारे कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जब वसाइल के मसले हैं, स्टाफ नहीं है, रिसोर्सेज लिमिटेड हैं, तो डेटा कलेक्शन ये एक बहुत बड़ी रिसोर्स मुझे लगता है इंतजामिया को मिल गई है, जिससे वो एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव डेटा सर्वेस कर सकें, आया वो कोविड के टाइम पे, आपने कहा सीनियर सिटीजन्स के टाइम पे हो, एटसेट्रा. सो दैट्स आल्सो वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग टू नो दैट दे आर बीइंग लेवरेज्ड और कैपिटलाइज्ड दिस वे. Very interesting learning over there.
मैं यहाँ पे सॉरी मैं एक पॉइंट ऐड करना चाहूँगी कि आप जहाँ डेटाबेस बात कर रही हैं, तो कोविड से पहले हमारे पैरालीगल्स ने सेंट्रल प्रिजन कराची के अंदर एक बहुत बड़ी डेटा ड्रिवन एक्सरसाइज की थी लीगल आइडेंटिफिकेशन के ऊपर उन प्रिजनर्स के लिए जिनके पास NICs नहीं हैं, जिनके मिसिंग हैं, जिनके रिन्यू हैं। तो तकरीबन 53 बैरिक्स में ये हमारे पैरालीगल्स ने जाके ये डेटा कलेक्ट किया था एंड इसकी बेसिस पे हमने पूरे नादरा को ये डेटा फराहम किया था और नादरा ने इसी डेटा के ऊपर बेसिस हमारे कैंप कंडक्ट किया प्रिजन के अंदर, जिसके मतलब रिजल्ट में 187 लोगों का NIC बना। और बेसिकली इसका मकसद यही था कि जो प्रिजन के अंदर कैदी हैं वो अपना वोट कास्ट कर सकें, क्योंकि उस वक्त इलेक्शन होने वाले थे और उस वक्त इलेक्ट्रिकल वोट का बहुत चर्चा था और प्रिजनर्स बहुत ज़्यादा विलिंग थे कि वो अपना वोट कास्ट कर सकें। तो लोगों ने बहुत ये एक वो नीडी चीज़ थी जिसके ऊपर हमारे पैरालीगल ने वो काम किया था, क्योंकि हम आम जितने भी लीगल एड के लोग भी हैं शायद उनको बैरिस तक एक्सेस नहीं है, लेकिन आपका पैरालीगल वो काम कर रहे हैं क्योंकि वो आपको सपोर्ट कर रहे हैं, प्रोवाइड कर रहे हैं डेटा जो कि हम नहीं ला सकते। अब इसी की बेस पे हम अपनी आगे सिफारिशात गवर्नमेंट को दे सकते हैं कि इतने कैदी ऐसे हैं जिनकी लीगल आइडेंटिफिकेशन नहीं है और ये लीगल आइडेंटिफिकेशन हर जगह।
आप काम करें इलेक्ट्रॉनिक वोटिंग पे। आपने थोड़ी चटपटी सी बात करी दी जो मैं चाह रही थी पॉडकास्ट में कोई ना कोई हमारे गेस्ट थोड़ी सी कंट्रोवर्शियल बात करते हैं तो शायद व्यूअरशिप हमारी बढ़ जाए. That's very interesting that they might play a small role in perhaps making one of the prisons in Sindh the first where prisoners have had a right to cast their vote, and that's really a huge thing. आप कह रही ना ये छोटी छोटी बातें, मुझे लग रहा है इनको हम piece together करेंगे तो ये बहुत बड़ा बहुत अहम काम हो रहा है, again which is being neglected, which is not being spoken about. So I mean, why is it not being why is it not the raving news in the academic circles? Why do we not hear more about this? You've been doing work. If we move away from the prisons, just very briefly, आपने community paralegal programs में हिस्सा लिया है communities के अंदर, which focus on women and which focus on reducing court pendency by making the paralegals a conduit for ADR, alternative dispute resolution methods. So how are those programs going in, and why do we hear more about all the good stuff that's happening?
That's a very hard question. The short answer, I think, in terms of academic circles, is that academic circles very easily exist outside of practical life, right? So, when I collect the data and put a paper together, then maybe somebody will, invite me to a conference and I could talk about it, right? Because the academic conferences are very, very particular. They're talking about academic work. And I know that's a very simplified, reductionist answer. But that's what I'm going to start with. And I want to go back to the second part of your question, which is what kind of work is being done and really why are we not talking more about it? Because the experience with the women's right to legal property and the ADR paralegals has been very enlightening for me. Because I understand that when LAS puts these groups together, there's a whole exercise that goes into selecting people who are, rooted in the community, they belong to the community. I think that's one of the core elements of a paralegal program. You can't impose somebody. I can't go and become a paralegal anywhere, other than my own neighborhood perhaps. And I think that's just crucial. I know it sounds obvious, but it's something that you really need to think about. And people like Sasi who put those cohorts together for us have really done the service of designing that program. The selection of paralegals is basically a big part of designing the program. And those women who came to the women's right to legal property were from really small towns, small communities, and they were more empowered and they knew more about, not in terms of legal rights, but they knew more about their capability in terms of what they can do and what they can do for the women around them, more than anyone else that I've met at least. And I've practiced and I've seen lots of women in communities. But these are women who are sitting in their homes and they are guiding each other and they're stepping up to kind of make sure that people get their rights in inheritance, and they're doing this without actually having a lot of legal knowledge, right? And then when we bridge in that gap, when LAS steps in with this program and it bridges that gap, it empowers a set of people who basically were probably just missing. This was the missing link for them to be able to deliver to their community these basic, like what Sana said, everybody needs to have a course in civics education. It needs to be part of our basic curriculum. But these communities are these paralegals are reaching communities who have never been to school. So it's not that you're even bridging that basic civics education gap. You're basically introducing them to the idea of citizenship and what it means to have rights as a citizen. And it breaks your heart to see that this needs to be done, but the fact that it's being done is just so heartening at the same time, because you see communities who are doing so much with nothing. And then you equip them, you give them these tools to be able to speak the language and navigate the law. And then you just give it to them and then they're off with it. It's like they're going to do so much more with that 1-2 days of training that we could ever imagine doing if we were to go in and set up camp and be like, come talk to us about your problems and we'll connect you with a lawyer. But just because they're rooted in the community, they understand the problems better, they speak the language better, they have the trust, and they're there 24/7. If there's an emergency, those people are there, the community paralegals are right there. So that level of impact and that level of just usefulness and literally access to justice. We talk, it's such a throw phrase, right? Talk about access to justice all the time, these programs. But that's access to justice. It's access to knowledge that's going to get you what you need to live your life, literally. That's what it is. And coming to ADR, I think ADR is, I feel like I might be wrong, but I feel like that's the most widespread program that we've done with LAS so far. Like 192 paralegals is at least what I have seen. And these paralegals are from 6 districts, and their dedication, they're crossing these flood-ravaged areas to come to Hyderabad, and there are no roads to go back to their homes. And I'm talking about this because it reflects the passion with which the work is done. And that's the passion with which the empowerment is done, and the difference comes about. It's not, and these things aren't fancy. I think the reason people don't talk about it because these are not quick fixes. These aren't instant solutions. These are long-term drudge work, rewarding drudge work that's going to produce change over some years. I'm not going to say a decade, but maybe 2 or 3 years at least, right? Because now they're going to, the conversations that have been happening in non-legal terms, in lay terms, are going to slowly shift and become slightly more informed, right? So, we talk about, for example, in ADR, we talk about how they go to their panchayat or they go to their vadera. They've been doing these things. They know these things. That's the thing about clinical legal education. It builds on knowledge that you know. There's nothing new about it. But it's giving you this language to be able to navigate systems that you perhaps might have been cut out of because you weren't speaking the language. I think that's a big part of clinical legal education, right? So people will talk about women's right to legal property more because you have videos which are going out with them. So it's about how you present it to the public. I think there's the program and then there's the publicity of the program, which then has knockoff effects of, awareness and people trying to replicate it across other parts of the country, because the only paralegal program that I know of is the one that LAS runs or LAO runs. And the reason I think is that, it's a whole process to transfer learning to other people. And because it's not fancy, it's not necessarily catching the attention of, donors or people with money who can actually make it happen. And I think when that happens, or maybe when we start writing about it more, the academic circles will pick it up as well, and then it will follow on from there.
Okay, thank you very much. I love what you said about, you help these people or you try to impart knowledge and then they're just off with it. And it's such a simple term, but I can feel what you mean by when they're off with it, with such passion. And it's really sort of sowing the seeds for the beginnings of a movement. And that's what we hope. That's the hope, right? With spending so much time working with them. So you've given us a glimpse into the key ingredients, I would say. You spoke a lot about getting the selection right is critical. So Umar, can you walk us through the bare bones? Can you give us the entire recipe for what goes in to designing an effective paralegal program, because you've done this? And also maybe tell us where we lie on the map when it comes to other leading programs from Sierra Leone or South Africa, because you've got that comparative know-how and knowledge of what's happening in other jurisdictions. So where do we lie? And if anyone listening into this is interested in designing such a program or rolling it out, in addition to selection, what else should they be cognizant of?
Yeah, Okay, so this is not going to be as structured as I would have liked my answer to be, right? But I'll start off kind of with what I'm being identified as a positive in the work that she's done, which is you want to find people that are motivated, right? So I said, the community paralegal brings a lot with them before, when they show up to your program. So often you'll want community paralegals that have pre-existing knowledge or the ability to obtain knowledge, that have had similar experiences, but most important is the fact that they are passionate about helping other people and helping their community. And that's because community paralegal programs are designed ideally to be sustainable, to be able to sustain past donor funding or government funding. And that really happens when they are motivated by the community themselves. So that's a key aspect of it. In addition to that, community paralegals are often asked to do a basic level of documentation, things like that. So you may want to look at things such as education levels, as well as their ability to communicate with other service providers, etc. So there's aspects like that. I remember when we were designing the selection criteria for the prison paralegal program, there are safeguarding elements to consider, particularly if you have community paralegals that are working with women or working with vulnerable communities, or with new prison inmates, and your paralegal themselves is a convicted prisoner, then you want to consider what those safeguarding elements might be. So there's that kind of aspect to it. I think the other important aspect I think people should keep in mind is whether this is a sort of a purpose-driven paralegal program, right? So Anbeen spoke about ADR being a separate paralegal program from women's inheritance, for example. Or is it an all-purpose kind of paralegal program where it's one person that has a basic level of legal knowledge and then focuses really more on being able to connect with other service providers? And I think the prison paralegal program serves as a good example because they're working with a definite community which has at least one overwhelmingly identifiable need, right? Which is how to navigate the criminal justice system, and that just makes it a lot easier to design the training material, pre-select the services that they can connect to, and really get going quickly, and then always add on to that, so you can build on to that. So that really, I think, is sort of some of the basic elements to consider when you think about community paralegal programs. I've said, right, so passion and motivation absolutely are key to sustainability, but at the same time, it's important to keep in mind what incentives will sustain the program. So in the prison paralegal program, for example, I think it's one of the best examples I can think of a sustainable incentive, which is where prison paralegals get a remission in their sentence. So a reduction in sentence in exchange for volunteering their time. So that's one example of that, where community paralegals are often funded by the community themselves, and that gives the community ownership as well as creates that accountability between the community and the paralegal that they will continue to provide those services. So there might be financial incentives, there might be non-monetary incentives, but really it is, I think, the community's ownership over the program. So I know other examples around the world where organizations selecting paralegal to a paralegal, and so when the community nominates someone, it's the community that holds them accountable for participation in training programs or to continue. So there are examples like that as well to keep in mind. I think from an international level, it's hard to really draw a comparison in it, and the reason I say that is because particularly now in 20, we're seeing community paralegals, anyone who talks about you in public, really need to be a little bit more careful, as you see authoritarian and democratic backsliding around the world. And so, we look at examples in South Africa or across Africa, and great examples of when there's been in how community paralegals can do a really good job of creating legal awareness and in making the legal system more inclusive for communities that have been historically excluded. Compared to, I'd say, in Pakistan, where if you're not talking about a momentous legal change, where where you're asking community paralegals to challenge then the status quo. The status quo hasn't changed, and there I think some of the challenges are different. And been working on women's access or right to inheritance or legal property, and I think that's work that will that's very meaningful, very important, but also carries significant risk. And so some of those risks might be different where you're talking about these contentious issues. Or for example, if you have a paralegal program in prisons that then generating complaints about the prison administration itself, absolutely essential to make sure that there's accountability in prisons. But at the same time, you have to be cognizant of some of the risks that your paralegals face, and to make sure that they're equipped to navigate those risks and have the adequate support. So I think in certain ways, the prison paralegal program is up there, is leading the way with some of the other programs that I've seen. The fact that it has a select community with such defined needs has sustainability. Sustained itself now for over 5 years, really I think is a good benchmark for other jurisdictions. And then similarly, I think when we talk about newer issues where people may not have been as aware, such as ADR, those are definitely examples where we can learn also from the rest of the world.
Thank you so much for highlighting the safeguarding challenges and the risks and reminding us of the sensitivity in our present context of being perceived as a human being, in actuality a human rights defender or a bearer of rights, or someone that's trying to help people fight the good fight on their own or speak up. And I think you had mentioned, or being one of you had mentioned, what I thought was so audacious, Umar, you had, is to make certain holders of power redundant. So that in itself is a big threat, whether that's to the bar councils or to other people that are just used to people turning towards them, relying on them, that are trying to monopolize the reach of the law. So Sana, अगर मैं आपके पास आखिर में आना चाहूँगी, बहुत सारी risks और challenges की बात उमर ने की in the context of prisons. Would you like to sort of balance that off with sharing a nugget or two of the impact that it's actually had on an individual who's been released, who's gone back into the community? I mean, I know it's touched countless lives. You've said that 6,000 prisoners have been empowered with legal information that they may not have otherwise had access to. But since you are in touch with so many prisoners on a day-to-day basis, maybe if you want to share something that's really made a measurable change in someone's life with us,
है ज़रूर। मतलब जहाँ रिस्क की बात हो रही है, रिस्क एंड चैलेंजेस की, तो इटसेल्फ जो प्रिजन में प्रिजनर्स रह रहे हैं वो ऑलरेडी रिस्क एंड चैलेंजेस से डील करते हुए आते हैं, तो उनको वो जो प्रिजन पैरालीगल प्रोग्राम में चैलेंजेस आते हैं तो उनको ऐसे चैलेंजेस लगते नहीं हैं। और जहाँ ग्राउंड इम्पैक्ट की हम बात करते हैं तो ऐसे हमारे जो पैरालीगल्स हैं यहाँ, क्योंकि ये कम्युनिटी जब पैरालीगल जो है वो एक प्रोग्राम के थ्रू हमने कोशिश की कि हम एक ना सिर्फ एक इंसान को सेल्फ तौर पे लीगल एम्पावर करें और फिर वो लीगल एम्पावर होके अपने इंडिविजुअल और कम्युनिटी को असिस्ट करें छोटे छोटे लीगल इश्यूज़ के ऊपर। तो हमारी वन ऑफ ओल्ड पैरालीगल हैं एक वुमेन प्रिजन कराची के अंदर, और जब मेरी उनसे बहुत बात हुई तफसीली तो मैंने उनकी ज़िंदगी को ना उसी इस लीगल एम्पावरमेंट अप्रोचेस के थ्रू देखा कि उन्होंने किस तरह से चेंज लाया। अकॉर्डिंग टू हर जब वो क्योंकि मैं नाम नहीं लेना चाहूँगी उनका, अकॉर्डिंग टू हर जब वो अरेस्ट हुई थी और वो जिस कम्युनिटी से बिलोंग करती थी उसमें इन फ्रंट ऑफ किसी भी आदमी के सामने बात तक नहीं करना अलाउ था। तो जब वो किडनैपिंग के केस में अरेस्ट हुई और मजिस्ट्रेट के सामने पेश हुई तो उनको ये नहीं पता था कि मैं इन फ्रंट ऑफ मजिस्ट्रेट कुछ बोल सकती हूँ कि एज अ वुमेन में मुझे बात करने का राइट है। तो जो भी केस का सिनेरियो था वो ख़राब हुआ क्योंकि उन्होंने अपना एक स्टेटमेंट नहीं दिया क्योंकि वो समझती थी कि मैं मर्द क्या भी नहीं कर सकती, और उनको 25 इयर्स की इम्प्रिजमेंट हुई। इसके बाद उन्होंने मुझे कहा कि दूसरा सेटबैक ये था कि मैं पढ़ नहीं सकती थी, मुझे अपनी केस फाइल्स पढ़ना नहीं पता था कि क्या गलत है क्या सही है। तो मेरे केस को उस चीज़ ने ख़राब किया क्योंकि मुझे जो वकील बताता था मैं वही सुनती थी। क्योंकि मैं पढ़ नहीं सकती थी। तीसरी चीज़ उन्होंने जो मुझे डिस्कस की हुई है कि उन्होंने कहा कि मुझे पैसे का इशू नहीं था, क्योंकि वो खुद किसी फैक्ट्री में वर्कर थी और मंथली 15 to 20,000 कमा लेती थी, तो मनी ऐसा इशू नहीं था, बट उनको ये अवेयरनेस नहीं था कि कहीं से भी जो क्राइम है वो एज अ लीगल क्राइम सोसाइटी कैसे देखती है। अगर मुझे कोई ये कह रहा है कि मैं एक बच्चा आपको ला के दे रहा हूँ अपने घर पे रखने के लिए, तो वो क्राइम है। अगर वो बच्चा किसी का उठाया हुआ बच्चा है और घर पे रखने के लिए आपको सिर्फ फैसिलिटेट करने के लिए दिया जा रहा है, तो इट्स अ क्राइम ना। तो वो उस चीज़ की अवेयरनेस उसको नहीं थी। तो एक तो ये वो सेल्फ एम्पावरमेंट थी जो उसने अपने केसेस के अंदर देखी। दूसरा, वो मालूमात जो वो प्रिजन के अंदर रहते हुए औरतों को देती रही कि इन जनरल, क्योंकि जब वो पढ़ाती थी तो औरतों को लगता था कि इसको बहुत कुछ पता है इस कानून के बारे में। तो छोटी छोटी मालूमात के अब मेरे FIR के बाद अब विटनेसेस चलेंगे, क्या मुझे उस वकील से पूछना चाहिए या नहीं चाहिए। और ख़ासकर उसने मुझसे कहा कि क्योंकि वुमेन प्रिजन के अंदर वायलेंस के केसेस बहुत हैं, जिसमें औरतें वायलेंस के हवाले से मार खा के या हस्बैंड के मर्डर के केसेस के अंदर आती हैं। तो कहने लगी कि मैंने उनको ये कहा कि अगर आप रोज़ अपने मियाँ से मार खा रही हैं तो इसका ये मतलब नहीं है कि आप अपने मियाँ को जान से मार दें। इसके लिए बहुत अदर प्लेटफॉर्म्स हैं, पुलिस स्टेशंस हैं, NGOs हैं, जहाँ पे आप जाके रिपोर्ट कर सकती हैं, आप केस फाइल कर सकती हैं उसके लिए। इसके लिए आपको किसी का जान से मारना ज़रूरी नहीं। तो ये बहुत छोटी छोटी इंफॉर्मेशन जो कि वो औरतों को दिन रात फराहम करती रही। फिर देन उनके जो कम्युनिटी में उन्होंने प्रिजन के अंदर रहते हुए इंफॉर्मेशन स्प्रेड की, वो ये कि उनकी कज़न थी जिनकी बहुत, क्योंकि वो जिस कम्युनिटी से बिलोंग करती थी, बहुत अर्ली एज में मैरिज हो जाती थी। 17 ईयर्स में उनकी कज़न की शादी हुई एंड देन उनके हस्बैंड उनको बहुत अब्यूज़ करते थे और उनको बहुत ज़्यादा टॉर्चर करते थे। देन उन्होंने अपनी फैमिली को कहा, जब विजिटेशन पे उनकी फैमिली आती थी तो उनसे अपने इशूज़ डिस्कस करती थी। उन्होंने अपनी कज़न को, अपने घर वालों को कहकर मैट्रिक करवाया कि आप इसको पढ़ाएं। देन जब हालात बेहतर नहीं हुए तो उन्होंने कहा आप खुला का केस फाइल करें, बहुत आसान है, हमारी वकील आती हैं, वो हमें बताते हैं कि खुला फाइल कर दो, तो 3 महीने में अगर मियाँ नहीं भी पेश होता तो खुला फाइल आपकी हो जाएगी, आपका राइट है ये। इस तरीके से खुला हुई एंड देन जब खुला हुई तो उन्हीं के ख़ानदान में किसी दूसरे ही कज़न से उनकी शादी हुई एंड देन जब पहले हस्बैंड को पता चला कि ये फॉल्स मैरिज इस तरह इसने की और देन उसने केस फाइल किया, तब ही हमारी पैरालीगल ने अपनी फैमिली को कहा कि जो बंदा आपको थ्रेट कर रहा है मैसेजेस पे, वो मैसेजेस कोर्ट में लेकर जाना है एंड सबूत के तौर पे पेश करना। मुझे लगता है इससे बड़ी सक्सेस आपको नज़र नहीं आ सकती। मतलब उस बंदी ने उस खुला का केस जीता और उसके बाद उसने कहा कि मैंने अपनी ज़िंदगी को ना सिर्फ खुद बदला है, बट मैं आज सोचती हूँ कि अगर मुझे ये सारी मालूमात होती तो मेरा अपना खुद का केस ख़राब नहीं होता। तो ये वो इम्पैक्ट है जो आपको नज़र आता है। सिर्फ आपके समझे कि 5 साल की ज़िंदगी में आपने अगर एक औरत की ज़िंदगी में इतनी तब्दीली की है कि वो अपने खुद की बुनियाद पे बाइख्तियार हुई है, उसने प्रिजन के अंदर रहते हुए औरतों को अवेयर किया, अपनी फैमिली कम्युनिटी को अवेयर किया एंड देन उसी औरत ने अपने बच्चे को पढ़ाया है एंड देन वो लॉ इतना जान गई है कि उसके बेटे ने अब हमारे एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन के अगेंस्ट पिटिशन फाइल किए, लॉ को आंसरेबल किया है कि मेरी माँ को 17 साल हो गए, आप पे रूल के ऊपर रिहा करें। एक बच्चा जो प्रिजन में रहता था, प्रिजन से गया है, SOS में रहा, उसने अपने बच्चे को पढ़ाया, उस बच्चे को उसने आज इतना अवेयर किया कि वो प्रिजन एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन होम डिपार्टमेंट के अगेंस्ट पिटिशन फाइल कर रहा है कि ये लॉ कहता है कि मेरी माँ को 17 साल हुए, प्लीज आप इसको रिलीज करें। तो ये सक्सेस है आपकी। तो मेरे ख्याल में इससे बड़ी सक्सेस मुझे नहीं लगता।
What a high note. I mean, बड़े अफसोस की बात है कि इनके साथ इनको 25 साल की उम्र कैद की सजा हुई है, 17 साल हो गए हैं, but at the same time, as they say, hope is the last thing to die. This narration of her son now continuing to be empowered by his mother, fighting the fight. That's really inspirational. Thank you so much, Sana, for bringing that human impact, that human element to the fore, in such an articulate manner. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. With this, I'd like to formally close the discussions today, thanking Omar, Rangbeen, Sana once again. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a great learning experience, so engaging, very informative discussions. I promised the audience, that it would not be generalist fluff, and it was anything but that. Really authentic sort of tones and voices based on your years of experience have come through. Sadly, माशरा हमारा instant gratification की बुनियाद पे चल रहा होता है. जिस तरह ने कहा 5 साल का प्रोग्राम है, इस खातून ने 5 साल काम करने के बाद ये चीज़ें बदली हैं. It takes time, but we're able to now put forward these successes and share them with the larger audience. There's a lot of potential for the paralegal movement to spread in Pakistan. It seems to be a promising emerging field in Pakistan with a lot of potential to change the countless number of lives that are waiting for justice and justice solutions. And we hope that we can start seeing more efforts such as yours, all three of you combined, in helping the law transcend itself from what it is currently, serving very few people, into, a guarantor of rights and equality for all. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आप सबका. Thank you very much.